I think the transition for me becomes not staying too much in suffering and turning that into struggling. Because if you're struggling, then you can at least get somewhere. And along the struggle, you learn more about yourself. But if you're suffering, then you're consistently in this dark cloud of mentally suffering and goes down a very Schopenhauer path.
Welcome to another episode of Outsider Inc. I'm your host, Ian Hathaway. Today's guest is Khatija Ali, founder and CEO of BioSapien, a biotech company on a mission to treat cancer locally. BioSapien's flagship product is the MediChip, a 3D printed biodegradable implant placed directly at the site of a tumor that releases chemotherapy slowly and locally over weeks instead of flooding the entire body through an IV. Khatija calls it a band-aid for cancer. The problem it attacks is one most of us know through someone we love. Roughly 30% of cancer patients stop treatment because of the side effects. BioSapien's goal is to treat 1 million patients by 2035. But Khatija's path here is anything but conventional. She was born in Saudi Arabia, moved to Canada as a young child, and grew up in suburban Ontario, starting her first business with her father at 16. A philosophy major who planned to spend her life as a professor, she was redirected by tragedy. Her father's colorectal cancer, diagnosed when she was 18, took his life just 3 years later. That loss redirected her towards medicine. While earning her medical degree, she fell in love with surgery, but walked away before ever practicing it. Instead, she chased an idea that hit her, sleep-deprived, in an operating room, with $10,000 from an attending physician who believed in her and her mother as her first investors. What followed is an outsider story on nearly every axis. A founder in an industry where only 2% of funding goes to female founders. A self-taught operator who learned the business of biotech doing deals inside a New York venture firm. A CEO who heard 1,000 no's and drove a taxi to keep her company alive. And then, the boldest move of all. She left America, where, in her words, you don't get funded in biotech unless you're in AI or gene therapy. She moved the company to Abu Dhabi, where BioSapien is now preparing for clinical trials, and where Khatija is helping build the region's biotech ecosystem from scratch. In this conversation, we'll talk about the losses that shaped her, how a philosopher thinks about building a company, what she learned about why medical innovation so rarely reaches patients, the realities of being a woman founder building in the Gulf, and the decision to put a cancer trial in a city nobody had on the biotech map. Khatija, welcome to Outsider Inc.
Thank you, Ian. That was a perfect intro.
It's so good to see you. Thanks so much for being here. I want to start broader than the company. Before medicine, you were a philosophy major and a physics minor at McMaster in Ontario, deep into metaphysics, reading Nietzsche, planning to become a professor and basically live under a tree. I know philosophy is your first love to this day. Before any of the cancer work, the thing pulling at you was this big unanswerable stuff. Why we're here, how we perceive reality, what reality even is. And it traces back to a kid in suburban Ontario who wanted to be an astronaut, thought about black holes, built potato clocks, drawn to the unknown before you had language for it. Looking back on that, what was the question that had a hold on you as a kid back then? And do you find you're still chasing some version of that now?
Wow, what a way to start this conversation. Yeah, look, I think ultimately the question I was trying to answer at that time was, what does it really mean to become who you really are? That's a loaded question because obviously you have to understand who you are to begin with, and then what it means to actually become something, and what does that mean externally. And so that's been the fundamental question I've been chasing. And then, of course, why are we actually here? I'm still driven towards that. You can see parts of that in my curiosity and how I operate with the business, with some of the angel investing that I do and some of the nonprofit stuff. There's always a question of why and what's the purpose and who does this benefit and who do we become in the process of building towards something. I think that's the question in itself. I grew up actually in a household where philosophy wasn't entirely just a subject in undergrad, more like a weekend activity where basically my dad and my mom had the social group where we would all come together and essentially debate different topics around philosophy and politics and religion. And really, I think by the time I got to grade 11, I dove in and took the first philosophy course in high school, fell madly in love with it, and realized that, okay, I formally want to start studying it alongside physics, because that was where it becomes dangerous, but also potentially useful. And that abstract thinking was what really got me excited towards that.
So I wrote down building towards something. We've talked in the past about stoicism and focusing on what you can control. I feel like that's a really consistent theme through your life. You have a good nose for opportunity and then putting in the work to make that opportunity a reality. You mentioned your parents, your first company wasn't BioSapien. At 16, you and your father started a family staffing business together. He was the CEO. You were out there chasing contracts and getting meetings. You credited that period as kind of your entrepreneurial spark. Tell me about that time, about him, about what working side by side with your dad that early on in your life taught you that maybe you didn't realize at the time, but looking back on it now that you were learning.
Honestly, it was a very interesting experience as a whole. I think maybe to answer that, I can go back a little bit around sort of his background and how we ended up in that situation to begin with. So my dad was actually an engineer for the Kingdom of Saudi and basically spent 18 plus years over there building out their oil refineries and essentially leading the charge. So that was the prestigious chapter of his life. And I think Canada, when we moved, that essentially became the Reinvention chapter. And so he became an entrepreneur out of necessity, not so much by choice, but that's what the circumstances demanded from him. And my mom worked 2 jobs to keep the food on the table. And so how that came into being in terms of building the first business with him is his idea was basically to become the middleman of large corporations like Coca-Cola, Minute Maid, and on the other side with general laborers. So protecting their interests, their salaries, their wages, and everything around that. He found this niche market in which there was a lot of appetite for large corporations like these factories to require hands-on general labor. And then there was a lot of general laborers that he knew as a part of his adventure and journey that could be potentially useful to these such corporations. And so he bridged that gap and put together a company called Tiger Force, which still makes me laugh till today. My brother was the CFO. I was the COO running the operations, in charge of scheduling, in charge of people management, trying to find contracts, putting together decks, trying to get a meeting in front of these factory owners, etc. And so what my summer really looked like when I was 16, besides summer school, was I would basically go with him to these factories, knock on the door, and trying to get in a meeting with somebody to say, hey, look at this value proposition. We can help you get general laborers. We can improve your productivity. We can improve your wages and just your overall packaging that you offer and help you with cost reductions, etc. So that was the thesis behind it. That was sort of my first experience in what I call the grand building, right? Where you essentially roll up your sleeves and you get it done. And I think that's something that's always been a message that both my parents have instilled in me over the years. And I couldn't be more grateful for that.
It's pretty wild that you had that level of responsibility and initiative at 16. But I can definitely see that ability to knock on doors and just make it work served you well later when it came to raising capital. No doubt we'll get to that in a minute. But at the end of your first year of university, unfortunately, your father was diagnosed with cancer. You were just 18 years old. I know that you were the youngest child. You were, to a large degree, his primary caregiver. You took time off of school to look after him. He went through the whole course, chemotherapy, radiation, surgery. I know that you even took an experimental treatment in China. Sadly, he passed away in January 2011 when you were just 21 years old. I have to imagine that was the worst moment of your life, but it changed you, right? You became hell-bent on pursuing medicine when you originally had planned to be a professor in philosophy. It feels like the curiosity that had once been about why are we here turns to dealing with what's in front of us now.
Yes.
What did caring for him do to you that philosophy student who just wanted to live under a tree. And how did it redirect your entire life?
Honestly, I think that was definitely a very catalytic moment in my life. Left a tremendous mark on me for sure. So much so that to your point, not only did I leave philosophy, I eventually left surgery to basically go and start a biotech company to try and alleviate human suffering. I grew up very bubbled, I would say, right? In the sense of I had a great family, the youngest of four. My summers were playing street hockey, and those were the concerns that the popsicles are melting faster than I could eat them. And so having to have that reality check of human suffering, to watch someone who you love, who's been the guiding compass of both morality and just how to navigate the world, I think was definitely a really hard challenge. I think the suffering became less theoretical. Schopenhauer was no longer words on a piece of page that I read. Schopenhauer was what I was living in terms of nihilism and this horrendous dread of life and its capabilities and what we can't control, and basically coming to terms with the reality of mortality as a whole, and we're all here to eventually die. And so that was really dark, I think, at 21. But really, once you get over the cloudy, depressing phase of grief and what it does to you, I think what it allows you to understand is that there's an opportunity here. We're sort of the ones that are left behind, and either we can do something with that and make an impact and try to change or alter the world in a better way, or we can just let that suffering engulf us and basically become Schopenhauer 2.0. And for me, as tempting as that latter was at times, it wasn't the most feasible path because it wouldn't do justice to him or me or anybody else. And so kind of had to pick up my shit and move on.
Well, so you fell in love with surgery in medical school. And then I read about the moment you had in a Houston operating room where you're literally saving someone's life, holding their beating heart in your hands.
Yes.
Which just seems wildly intense, but it also revealed to you that surgery has a ceiling. There was sort of a helplessness. You're dealing with pancreatic tumors spreading into arteries and nerves that a surgeon could never touch. And somewhere in that, this idea hit you that you could create and embed this drug in a printable, biodegradable material delivered right to where it's needed. Looking at that time, we've got this philosopher, this grieving daughter, this surgeon, and this stubborn idea all in the same person. At what point did it stop being something that you were just researching or had a curiosity about to become this thing that you were going to go out and pursue?
I have an MD, and basically right as I was graduating from medical school, decided to open BioSapien and pursue that. So I never actually ventured down the path of surgery, which is my second and first love, I would say. Surgery, I think, is a beautiful way to combine art and medicine with human gratification all in one nice little bubble. So It definitely fulfills me in a different manner, for sure. I think the driving factor for me as to wanting to leave something that I love so much to pursue this was ultimately that conversation with my attending, Dr. Marshall, and a few others along the way, including Dr. Rapanos, who's a vascular surgeon over at McMaster University, basically telling me these three things. One, the idea is incredible and much needed. It's something that they would use and they would support. And so that was validating for me that, hey, colleagues of mine feel like this is a tool that surgeons need in their hands, especially when it comes to pancreatic or other kind of surgical oncologies where the tumor is too large and you can't resect it and it's a failed surgery for the surgeon. So that was nice and validating to hear that I was actually solving a problem for my colleagues. Then the second part of it was essentially a dinner conversation I had with Dr. Marshall, who wrote me that first $10,000 check. And literally, she brought a centrifuge to the restaurant. I still have it. I don't know what to do with it, but it was momentum and symbolic. And I think if I remember correctly, the conversation went something like, there's so many surgeons in the world and you can always pursue medicine and become a surgeon when the time is right. But fundamentally, there's this problem that you can solve for a lot of people. You have the drive. It's something personal. And at that point, I had about 4 other startup companies under my belt. So I had some idea of how to build a business and what it entailed. And then to see her actually take out a checkbook at the end of dinner and write me a $10,000 check, I think was definitely a nice push. And then the last really came from my mom, who wrote the second check of $10,000 the next morning as I'm telling her this conversation over the phone. And she's saying to me, she's right, this is a good product. You should definitely give it a shot. Try it for 6 months or a year and see where it takes you. And here I am still chugging away at it. So I think it was definitely the driving confidence of my colleagues, of people who are close to me, validating that the product in itself could exist and there was a market and working towards that. And of course, just being a stubborn person that I am. So.
Yeah, persistence pays. Okay, so you mentioned the product. Let's talk about that. Give me the simplest possible version of what MediChip actually is. Maybe explain it in a way that you would to a patient, what it does, what it can change about the experience that a person would have going through a cancer treatment.
Certainly, yeah. Current traditional standard of care treatments right now means that you go to a hospital, you sit in a chair tied to a machine for several hours on end, and they're basically giving you IV chemo that's going in through your entire body, even though the cancer might be located in the very corner of a stomach, for example. And so what we aim to do at MediChip is essentially remove that entire paradigm altogether and say, look, patients don't need to be suffering sitting in a hospital trying to get IV chemo and blasting the entire body for hours on end. Instead, why don't we take the bioavailable drug that's required in its dose form? So let's say, taking a step back, that IV bag has 1,000 milligrams. When you look at bioavailability and how drugs break down and where it needs to go, you essentially end up with about 10 to 15% of drug at the actual site. And so the thesis is, instead of trying to put 100% of drug throughout the entire body in the hopes that 15% get to it, why don't we just take that 15%, put it in a simple chip directly on top of it, allowing it to release and break down at the actual site. And so what this looks like for patients is they get a scope. Someone says, oh, you've been diagnosed with cancer, but don't worry, someone out there in the world created this product called MediChip. We've put this in as you're waiting to see your surgeon to have the tumor removed. And essentially, it's providing chemotherapy directly to the site. You don't need to come see us for another 3 weeks. You can eat, sleep, you keep your hair. Everything is great. And we'll do a check in a week from now to just make sure the chip's in place and ensure that there's no additional harm. So that's a value proposition for the patient. And the value proposition for pharma on the back end of that is that 30% that you mentioned that don't want systemic chemo. And not to sound too much of a business, but ultimately that's revenue being lost for a pharma company. And that's an opportunity for patients as well that we could pull back and open that market for. So MediChip can unlock that as well.
So cancer is a disseminated disease. We talked about how some patients will drop out because they're essentially exhausted by it. So is MediChip, is it a complementary tool or a replacement for systemic treatment?
Yeah, no, our plan is not to replace systemic treatment. This is really meant for localized disease, right? So if we take a subset, for example, rectal cancer. In rectal cancer, you go through the paradigm of getting chemo, you get radiation, and you still get left by what's called a near complete response, meaning that you still have a little bit of tumor left, roughly the quantity of 1 to 2 centimeters large, and it's a small nodule that remains. And so what you do in that scenario is a process under the Oprah trial called wait and watch. You just watch to see if the cancer will go away. And generally, in half of the patients, it does. And that's great. But the other half of the patients, it does not. And what their treatment options include is essentially going to surgery and having their rectum potentially removed. And so they're pooping in a bag for the rest of their life. That's the paradigm that we want to change. We want to be able to give patients an option to say, before we take the extreme measure of chopping things out, let's try this chip and see if we can provide some local therapy at the site. Now, zooming out, MediChip is a platform. And so we think it's anticipated for all localized solid tumors down the line. So it's something that could be used in tangent in therapy with chemo and with radiation. And so part of our phase 2 clinical design is to give MediChip with chemo, to give MediChip without chemo, to give it with radiation, to give it without radiation, and then give it as a stand-alone monotherapy, essentially, meaning by itself. Obviously, the data will drive whether this is something that goes in conjunction with chemo, with RADs, or monotherapy. the way that I see it is it's ultimately complementary to chemo. So you have some disseminated disease, but you've got some nodules in your lung and liver that really could be hyperfocal, that need some high dosages, and you just plug those in at that site. And it degrades over a course of 1 month and releases the chemotherapy to the site.
Very helpful. Thank you. You mentioned colorectal cancer, which, as we discussed before, is what your father had. But that wasn't the original vision, right? It was pancreatic cancer in the beginning. So obviously founders have to pivot constantly. This seems higher stakes and definitely more scientific. So talk to us a little bit about that evolution and what it took for you to make that pivot.
Yeah, definitely. So you're right on in terms of pancreatic cancer was our first line of indication that we wanted to target. And the reason why is it came from the clinical need. So when you're doing a Whipple procedure and you're trying to remove parts of the cancer that sit on the pancreas, it's a 5-hour procedure. It requires removal of multiple organs. It's very stressful. You have to be super specialized to do it. And so imagine going through all of that as a patient and as a surgeon, only at the end to find out that, oh, I'm sorry, it's impinging upon a blood vessel and we can't remove the cancer altogether. And so the surgery was a fail. That's lost morale for the surgeon, but more so lost opportunity for the patient. And so we built MediChip with that in mind, that if a surgeon is standing at the OR, he has no other tools, he can't cut out the cancer. How else can you downsize it? You could take the chip, throw it on, downsize the tumor, and potentially go back and retrieve it along with the tumor in 3-4 weeks' time. And if you think about it, it makes sense. It takes 5 hours to go to the pancreas. Let's say we put a chip inside and something goes wrong in a phase 1 safety. It's going to be very difficult to retrieve that chip. And so we thought, what's the lowest hanging fruit in terms of ease of access from an anatomical perspective that also has the highest unmet need and could also fulfill the opportunity in the market as well. And so that's where rectal cancer came to the forefront as the lead indication of our pipeline.
So you touched a little bit on early funding sources, opportunities. I know when you were getting BioSapien off the ground in New York, you were pulled into biotech venture capital. You did a few dozen deals. 3 of the companies went public. You had some outlier successes, some write-offs. And I know it left you with this lens where you saw where physicians understand these unmet needs, but are often not considering the business side in a complete and comprehensive way, while the VCs are just focused on only chasing these biggest markets, which can sometimes mean they overlook rare or pediatric diseases. What did sitting on the money side of the table teach you that medical school never could have? And how has it affected the way that you're thinking about and building the company today?
I think that experience was extremely valuable. For me, initially, it was a survival mechanism because it was a job that paid. Whereas my company is a little bit bootstrapped. But in a way, it was actually a form of like due diligence on myself and what we're building. And so I wanted to see the same problem from both sides of the table, right? And what the investment side really gave me was pattern recognition, I would say, at scale. Whereas hundreds of companies, you see what breaks them, you see what they build, you get a particular lens, like you said, of founders and their approaches. And I kept thinking that there's a gap of what the science could actually do versus what actually reach patients versus what actually makes money. And so for me, I think the exciting part was acknowledging that gap and then realizing that to pivot from this full-time venture capital where I love what I was doing wasn't really this dramatic moment, but it was more of this reckoning of I'd like to spend more time to build the thing that is meaningful for me. And so I just stopped working in the VC space, although I really enjoyed it and hope to go back to it one day, just so that I can build out BioSapien and give it the full attention that it needed.
I know then flipping back to the other side of the table, trying to raise for BioSapien, and it was brutal.
Yes.
You got 1,000 no's. You were Ubering around New York just to keep the company alive against the odds. Take me back to that period, those early days when you're trying to raise that critical early capital. What does the 1,000th no do to a person? Was there a moment when you thought about walking away, and what actually kept you in the game?
Look, hearing no is never fun, but I think if you hear it the first time, you're like, oh man, that sucked. And then you're depressed for a week. You hear it the second time, you're depressed for 5 days. You hear it the third, you're like, okay, whatever. So that's what it was in magnitudes. I think I've always been of that philosophy that unless you ask, the answer is always no. Always was anticipating a no anyways, right? And so it's more of, hey, can you surprise me in saying yes? Was my mindset and how I approached it. Look, every no for me is a data point, right? To try and improve either the story, the business, the problem, or just in how we articulate the solution. And so I think every single person who said no to us along the way, some converted and had a yes down the line and are now our investors, for which we're grateful for. Along the way, we've just learned how to pivot and how to get better at taking no's. And I think I really have to thank Robert Greene. There's a book that's called The Laws of Human Nature that really helped me understand the importance of emotional intelligence and really understand, as long as you don't take things personally, you can always learn from the experience. And so I embodied that 100%. And I've got some funny stories I can tell you about people I've chased and the no's I've gotten. And
Yeah.
But we'd be here for hours. So
I'm a huge Robert Greene fan. He actually has a somewhat recent book called War, which is a great book, I think, for someone in your shoes right now as a CEO or just really any human being who's out trying to do something. So I kind of want to flash forward a bit to where I feel like this story really becomes like true heart of what we're trying to do here on Outsider Inc. The obvious play for a biotech founder is to be in Boston or San Francisco. Instead, your next chapter is in Abu Dhabi, which is where things really start to take off for you. Part of that was a diagnosis you had about America, that unless you're in AI or gene therapy, you're not going to get funded. But I know another part of that was this opportunity that Abu Dhabi specifically presented for you. And of course, there's this interesting third layer because in a way, it's you returning to the region where you were actually born. So looking at that whole decision, from the outside, this looks like a bold contrarian strategy bet, but I know in these conversations with you is actually quite sensible. So walk us through that decision and what it was like to actually follow through with it.
I think that was one of the most difficult pivoting moments of my life, to try to explain to my team we are now picking up everything and going all the way across the other end of the world, in which the Middle East appears in the news more frequently than it should. And so that was a difficult conversation to have. It became a lot easier when you take away the sort of political and geopolitical elements of the story. Ultimately, what we were trying to achieve is what's the fastest way to get this product to patients. And so we looked at the world and said, okay, on the map here, which regions or which countries could potentially accelerate that? So Japan was on there, Australia was on there, India was on there, and UAE had appeared as itself as an opportunity. The reason why we didn't move forward with Japan is, one, they move a little bit slower than anticipated. Their regulatory speed is 6 to 9 months, and there's a very obvious language barrier in its regulatory submissions and parties and so on and so forth. And we thought, okay, that might be a heavier lift than we can potentially manage at this time. We started looking at Australia and thought, okay, that could be a potential opportunity, but that required obtaining R&D credits from the US, setting up a whole operational team in Australia, which was very disconnected from the world. And so the logistics and supply chain of trying to make the chips in the US and ship them, it just seemed like a nightmare for us at that point, and thought, okay, maybe that's not the best solution. We looked at other places in Southeast Asia and just decided that from a regulatory perspective, there's been a little bit of scrutiny around that. And so maybe not the best for us to put our first in human in there. From the UAE side, the thing that was really intriguing for us was, one, is their regulatory framework and timeline is roughly 30 days. And so that's the fastest in the world. And given that they have all these infrastructures with Cleveland Clinic, all pharmas are out there like Sanofi, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, et cetera, conducting clinical trials. For me, I thought it was fascinating that startups had not infiltrated or activated that ecosystem. And so to your point, one, it was a way to give back, but two, is this opportunity to be a pioneer in a phase 1 oncology trial in a country or in a region that was near and dear to me. Plus, it was extremely cost effective. And so it just made the most sense that we would move the operations there. And they actually allowed us to do our IND approvals and filing. We've gone through that process and happy to say came out the other end with an approval.
So that's super interesting. You said you needed to leave the country in order to accelerate your development. What were the structural reasons, advantages to leaving the US, or the deficiencies in the US? And then just general lessons about operating in a quote unquote less developed ecosystem?
Look, we're still a U.S. company. We're still based here, but our operations did move to the UAE. And I think one of the driving factors for that in 2023, if you recall, was FDA was a little bit of a black box. There was a lot of uncertainty. And I think that was the driving factor for us from a structural standpoint to say, yes, this makes more sense. If we're going to have ambiguity and we're going to have uncertainty around how this is going to play out, let's try it in an ecosystem that gives us the opportunities and sort of a launch pad, including grant funding, including connections, including accelerated pathways, rather than to try and get this trial rolling in a black box regulatory framework. I would say that was the ultimate driving factor behind it. The second was New York has changed. New York I now see more as growth capital. It's not really early stage. I think San Francisco is very tech focused. San Diego actually is more of a biotech hub, which is where we're housed now. So we're basically between San Diego and Abu Dhabi in trying to interlink our manufacturing here in the US with our clinical operations in the UAE. From a structural standpoint, I think the biggest benefit for us was really being part of the Hub 71 program. So this is a Mubadala-backed, Mubadala is the sovereign wealth fund of the UAE-backed accelerator program, which actually provided us a launch pad. So when we got there, we got a grant to set up the companies through the ADGM, through a freehold, essentially had some incentives to do visas, housing, and just the basic living elements of it. And then not to mention that through their TechStar program, I believe that's where we met, Ian.
Yeah.
But through their TechStar program, they sort of introduce you to their ecosystem. And look, there's no denying it. This is something I've been vocal on every panel in the UAE. It is a small ecosystem. It is new. It is growing. It has its flaws. But I would say that the drive is there, the passion is there, and the infrastructure, for the most part, is there to get the ball rolling for a clinical phase company to move their assets forward and reach their milestones. So the last thing is, I would say in regards to my message to founders, it doesn't have to be about UAE. Look, I think UAE has been wonderful to us. I've had more awards from them than I can handle, and the recognition has been tremendous. Honestly, the support was amazing. We were trying to close a $100,000 bridge round with angels. We ended up closing $950,000 in 3 weeks. So I think capital was not the problem. I think it was really more around understanding the problem that you're solving, having conviction in that, and to your point, the person spearheading that and their conviction in what they're building. So I would say to founders, take the leap of faith. The answer is always no unless you ask, right? And you're always going to fail if you don't try. And so worst case scenario, you come out as someone who has a bunch of battle scars and a bunch of cool stories to share over beer versus somebody who doesn't. So from a philosophical standpoint, it's a journey worth going on. It's worth having the experience and staying out of that bubble of I have to build the traditional New York way and raise my Series A on a private jet. But all these crazy stories that you hear, which are not really realistic for the rest of us who are building on the ground.
Most of our listeners are in North America and carry a lot of assumptions about the Gulf region and maybe what it's like to be a woman building a company there. So just kind of give me your honest assessment as a woman running a biotech company in the Middle East. What do Westerners get wrong about the region? What do they get right? What do you wish they knew about the region, both its strengths and maybe where it still falls short?
I think there's a lot. I'll tell you a funny story and then I'll answer it. I went to JP Morgan last year and met some of my old friends. And one of them came up to me and said, "Oh, Khatija, it's so nice to see you here." I said, "Oh, yeah, likewise." He said, "Oh my God, I have to ask you this." He said, "I know you love driving. So do you still drive?" And I just started laughing. Where do we start? So yeah, I think there's some fundamental things that I think the West is way off about, for sure. I would say to anybody listening to this, don't believe everything you read. Everything that you read on the internet or everything that you see in movies. The Middle East is not as backward as people think. I think people forget that it was actually the Arab civilization that generated algebra, scientific theories, calculus, the fundamental frameworks on which we do financial deals. The concept of a bank is Islamic. And so I think it's important to not fall for those narratives and really to remain open-minded. That's something I definitely wish people knew more of. Now, looking on the other side of things, everything in the US or in North America as a whole is a little bit transactional. I show you a deck, you give me the money. That's not how things work in Abu Dhabi or in the Middle East. It's more of, hi, we're going to sit down and have 7 coffees. And in those 7 coffees, I'm going to get to know you. And those 7 coffees are weeks apart, months apart. And you have to have patience and tenacity to be able to develop a relationship which is based on trust. And I think once you develop that, then it's a different story, because then you're an insider at that point and no longer an outsider. The last thing I'll say regarding that is there's always insane stories that you hear about different parts of the world. And so you just have to be open-minded and experience it for yourself. So again, anyone who's interested, happy to have a conversation, happy to make introductions, and come visit us in Abu Dhabi. I'll take you around for a nice gin. We can drive in my car and blast some music with the windows down.
Obviously, having spent time in Abu Dhabi, I can't say enough. Really special people and special place. Definitely encourage everyone to check it out. Look, everything in this story, the abstracts, the lots of no's moving across the world, it points to this moment, this one thing, the first time the MediChip goes into a human being. I know the trial is coming in Abu Dhabi, in low GI cancers. It's the line that every biotech company has to cross, and most don't make it past. You have to go from belief to evidence. It's a critical juncture. You're raising a Series A behind it. Just reflecting on this moment, what does the first patient mean to you? How does it change the weight of the job as the founder, as the doctor, as the person who's carried this idea for so long? And then maybe what does success look like for you scientifically and commercially for the company?
Honestly, Ian, I've said this probably the last 6 weeks nonstop to anyone who'll hear me. I've spent 12 years of my life to try and get to this next milestone, which is like unfolding in the next month. It's unreal. It's unbelievable. It's like the light at the end of the tunnel, because everything, in my mind at least, was to get to this point. And I've said this to all my investors, is I would love to be in that OR when the MediChip goes into the first patient. And for me, it's going to be a series of things. And I think about this a lot philosophically. One, it's going to be excitement around, okay, hey, we've made it to this milestone, which most people don't, because we've crossed the valley of death twice along our journey of biotech building. That's obviously one. Two, we've made a huge impact and potentially opened the doors for other patients, other indications, other pharmaceutical companies. And so this can become revolutionary and actually change the way that delivery occurs across the globe in various cancers for everybody. And so that's an excitement and a reality that I think will only unfold once we get back the cohort 1 safety data. But the third thing I think is honestly a little bit of relief. Like, hey, we actually said to our investors in the GCC that we were going to reach these milestones. And despite all the bumps and hurdles along the way, here we are. We proved the infrastructure works. We've turned on the machine and we've done the thing that we said we would. And if I'm just being real with you, Ian, I've put on my philosophy hat, probably a little bit of grief, because I would say that I would love to have a time machine in which I could take a chip back without getting too sentimental about that. I think that part is something that's very fascinating, and I'm excited to see how I feel on that day. To answer your question on what success looks like, success for me from an endpoint is, look, phase 1, our primary endpoints are safety, feasibility, tolerability. Is this thing safe? Can it stay inside the patient? Is the patient able to keep it and tolerate the treatment? Then next we're looking at, okay, let's look at the PK of the product itself, meaning how does it actually release the drug? Does it actually get to the site? And the tissue aspects of bioavailability, et cetera. And that's our secondary endpoint. And then the tertiary is, okay, did it have an efficacy signal? I think success for me is that nobody gets hurt. We show that the product is safe. We walk away with a strong safety profile and a signal that says, yes, we can move on to phase 2 to now look at efficacy, where we can measure how effective this treatment is in comparison to standard of care. I think for me, that is success in a nutshell.
I'm excited to see how things evolve over the next few years and have you back. And hopefully we're all celebrating a successful IPO of the company, right?
We'll go to New York Stock Exchange together. I actually know them fairly well. So.
Oh, wow. I would love that. That would be amazing. I want to shift gears now to you as a leader. You have a real philosophy, of course, of leadership. And I think it comes from seeing the industry from a lot of different angles, from the VC side, the clinical side, from this founder operator side. Even inside of BioSapien, the way you hire is unconventional. What's the thing that you do most differently as a leader in a deliberative way? And what do you think the credentialed default version of this industry keeps getting wrong about who belongs in the room when hard medical problems need to get solved?
That's a tough one, because if I tell you what I think about what a great leader I am, that would be absolute BS. I think the thing that I do well, that I've gotten feedback from my team and just everyone around me, consultants, investors, is that I probably over communicate. And I think that's something that maybe not a lot of leaders do, or leading from a perspective of curiosity and compassion rather than direction and authority. I think if you lead with compassion and understanding and trying to work on the problem together rather than, hey, this is your problem and you need to solve it and you drop the ball, it's a collective, hey, we have this problem as a team. How do we overcome this issue? And then we'll deal with whoever dropped the ball later. I think that's something that is not very common in the VC world. That's not something that's very common in industry. I think people can learn and be a little bit more forgiving in terms of just the process, the mistakes, the thoughts. Having a space where people can say, I don't know the answer, but I'll go find one, is, I think, something that we do very well in our company culture. And we actually encourage that. That's something maybe the industry is missing. Also, we're about to go into bio, and I guarantee every room I'm going to walk into is going to be 56-year-old white men. And so I would say the industry needs to be a little bit more diversified. It needs to be a little bit less judgmental around who's in the room. And you never know when a great idea will pop up from someone who doesn't maybe have the background or the knowledge to bring that idea to reality, but that doesn't mean that the idea itself cannot come to reality if you bring the right experts around the table. If you're trying to build an app, I don't have to be the one that codes the app and understands the app and all the infrastructures and frameworks of how it's put together. I just need to have an idea and find a really good coder that can do that for me. So similarly, that concept of remaining open, remaining confident, remaining compassionate and clear, and understanding we're all working towards making human lives better, I think is something that the industry can definitely learn from.
So continuing on that thread of changing the operating environment for entrepreneurs, operators, employees, there's a version of your story where you prove the platform, you build BioSapien, the company, and you stop there. But I know you are frequently talking about creating something bigger. You're actively helping to build the biotech ecosystem in Abu Dhabi and beyond. We talked before about how nascent that ecosystem is. You're involved at Hub 71. You've done some angel investing. I know you're part of a industry group of life science investors and CEOs that has talked about getting a early stage biotech fund off the ground. An ecosystem needs startups, needs institutions, needs investors, particularly in the MENA region where a lot of this stuff is still nascent and lacking. You mentioned you've been at this 12 years. It's been hard work. You've had to make a lot of sacrifices to get to this moment. After everything it's cost you to break into this industry, why take on that extra work? Why take on the harder job of building the ecosystem itself? And maybe what do you wish had existed when you were a founder getting the door slammed in your face 1,000 times by investors?
Wow, that's a good question. I'm going to say something that's going to sound so silly and limited, but like, why not?
Yeah.
But like, really, why not? I wrote that on one of our philosophy exams in undergrad. The question was why? And I wrote why not as the answer. And I stand by that 100% today. I think if there's an opportunity to build something, you should definitely go and take it and try to make an effort and leaving a dent into the universe. I think that for me, supporting other founders, supporting tech, especially in the region, is something that's really meaningful and exciting, and definitely something that I'm working on in the background currently as well. I'm trying to create a space in which founders and the ecosystem as a whole can come and collectively work together and grow and learn from one another. I find that the current biotech industry is a little bit groupie, if I may, and trying to essentially establish our own group. If they won't let you sit at the table, you make your own. When I was building and getting doors slammed in my face, there were not a lot of people that I could turn to and say, hey, I need help, or hey, how do you navigate this, or hey, can you look at this for me and help me out? I think I had some really good founders and mentors and advisors that I leaned on. And so I think if I can combine all of those together, essentially loop them into an ecosystem, we can grow that together.
Continuing on that thread, this pondering of why we're doing what we're doing, chasing these questions about why we're here, how to make sense of reality. You began there philosophically, and then you've spent your whole career turning suffering into something that at least you could in part engineer against. A material you can print, a tumor you can treat locally, side effects you might reduce. So you believe that at least some suffering is an engineering problem. But you've also sat with your father through the part of it that no technology was ever fully going to fix. So my question to you, is suffering a problem to be solved? Where's the line for you between the suffering that's an engineering problem and the suffering that just simply has to be lived?
Wow, I wish I had a beer for this one.
Go ahead, crack one.
I think suffering is something that's absolutely necessary. Suffering is something that is a part of life, and I think it's something that we all fundamentally have to go through without anyone's consent. We have no choice but to go through it. I think the transition for me becomes not staying too much in suffering and turning that into struggling, because if you're struggling, then you can at least get somewhere, and along the struggle you learn more about yourself. But if you're suffering, then you're consistently in this dark cloud of mentally suffering and goes down a very Schopenhauer path, where I think struggling for me turns it into more of a Nietzsche's framework, where when you strip it to the core of it all is about your examined self and who you are, and the idea that people mostly live reactively. Their inherent values, their fears, their self-concept, all of that combined. And so everyone reacts from it and therefore falls into the state of suffering perpetually. For me, the goal is to try and actually look at that and say, what if you trace back every impulse back to where it came from and asked, what if you chose a different outcome consciously? Would that lead you to suffering? Most likely not. It would lead you to struggle. And struggle would allow you to find out who you are during that suffering rather than just sitting in it, if that makes sense.
I just would say, holy shit, that was probably one of the best exchanges I've had on this show. That was very enlightening. Great answer.
A lot of suffering came from it.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. I was explaining to one of my sons about music, and there's this rapper that we like. He passed away. His name was Mac Miller, and you can hear the real struggle in his voice. And I was explaining to my son about how suffering and struggle actually are almost prerequisites for beautiful art.
Yeah.
And he said to me, Dad, I can really feel the pain in his voice. And so suffering, struggle, it's all part of the human existence, but it ultimately creates meaningful new forms that we can all benefit from. So thank you for sharing that.
Of course.
I want to end where we began. Before medicine, the question that had a hold on you was why we're here. Why do we exist? And you've had an entire life happen since then. You lost your father, you left medicine, you built this amazing thing. You bet the company on a place most biotech founders would never even have considered, let alone been able to find on a map. Your first business was with your father. Your mother wrote BioSapien's first check. The company's founding question is whether fighting cancer can be about regaining control instead of losing control, which is something your father never got. So let me ask this way, not to the person you were then, the person you are now, not the philosophy student under the tree, the CEO who has this lived experience. After all of it, do you feel like you have a clearer answer for why we're here, what we're doing? When you imagine the version of this company where everything works, massively successful, looking ahead, the patients you reach, the ecosystem you help build, the thing you leave behind, what do you hope it's all for?
I wish I'd gotten these questions in advance, Ian, so at least I had. At least I could say something, because wow, wow, that was a great question. What is it all for, right? I think ultimately the purpose of human life is for us to be able to experience the divine in whatever way, shape, or form you think it exists in a way that the divine could not experience itself. And so I think for me, the purpose of life is to be able to live it in every way possible, to experience the things that are meant to be experienced, to be curious, to build, to break, to cry, to fall apart, to rebuild, to fail, to get up, to have that human experience and essentially meet your maker at the end and for him to say, well fucking done with what I gave you.
That was beautifully said. Well, look, we're almost out of time. But here on Outsider Inc., we like to finish with a little segment we called Beyond the Bio. These are just some quick hit questions that let us step away from your resume and learn more about what makes you you. Sound okay?
Perfect. Let's do it.
All right. What's a quick piece of advice from a mentor that's stuck with you throughout your journey?
It will always take twice as long. You'll need twice as much the money, and everything that can go wrong will go wrong.
Only twice as long and twice as much. It's probably more than that.
My God, he was wrong. It took 3 times.
Yeah, exactly. Who is an unsung hero in your life, and what has been the impact they've had on you?
Unsung hero would have to be my mom. She thinks I definitely don't like her. And I'm going to take this moment to tell her that I love her a lot and I actually look up to her a lot. I would say that all of my hard work ethics, everything that I've done has been through that unsung hero.
Amazing. Who's someone in your local startup community or your broader network who doesn't get enough credit and deserves a shout out?
Michael Lintz from Golden Gates Venture, who has been an absolute rock throughout this entire rocky road that we've had over the last 6 months. And his response to me when I said, thank you, Michael, for everything, he said, Rocky is what we do. Keep on rolling.
That's amazing.
No, he's awesome.
Oh, yeah. Tell us something most people don't know about you, something outside of work. Could be a hobby, a favorite travel spot, a guilty pleasure, or maybe even a hidden talent.
Okay, let's see here. I've got a bunch. I write poetry in my free time that a lot of people would never expect from me. The fastest I've gone on a vehicle is 210 miles an hour, and I enjoyed that a lot. And I like adventure, so I skydive. If I could combine the two together, if I could do a haiku while falling, that's a dream.
Oh, wow. Yeah, curing cancer, skydiving, poetry. Cool. Check. Okay. What are 1 or 2 songs you'd like to add to our Spotify Founders playlist? Something that fuels your workday or maybe has inspired you on your journey as an entrepreneur?
Oh my God, there's so many, but I have to give a shout out to Eminem for Lose Yourself, because nothing like that gets me pumped up right as I'm about to go on stage to pitch. And the second one, I would say, is a little boring, but I would say it's Bach, Symphony 5. It's an incredible thing to continuously work to, especially if you're trying to get through decks or financial models or trying to memorize anatomy.
That's excellent. Good range. I know this one's going to be tough, this next one. What's a book you might recommend? Something that's been especially valuable to you on your journey, or maybe one that you think every first-time founder should read as they're getting going?
I think I mentioned this, The Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene, 100%. And For Blood and Money if you're building in biotech.
That's great. Okay, last question. If you could give one piece of advice to someone who's about to start their first company today, particularly someone who's maybe a bit of an outsider, what would it be?
Don't do it unless you really mean it. It's not worth the fame. Only do it if you can handle that suffering. That's all I can say.
That's a great way to end. Khatija, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your incredible story. I am so excited to share it with our listeners.
Awesome. Thank you for having me here, Ian. It was an honor. I really appreciate it.
That's a wrap for today's episode of Outsider Inc. A big thank you to Khatija Ali for joining us and sharing her incredible journey and wisdom. What stays with me isn't the regulatory arbitrage or the move to Abu Dhabi. It's that every consequential decision in this story traces back to a room she couldn't leave. A father's diagnosis at 18, 3 years as his caregiver. A young philosopher who wanted to live under a tree but instead got an MD. A medical student who fell in love with surgery but pivoted to build a company around an idea for a better cancer treatment. 1,000 no's later, she's still here. What Khatija understands better than most is the difference between suffering and struggling. That one engulfs you and the other reveals you. She's built a company on the belief that some suffering is an engineering problem, and a life on the acceptance that the rest of it isn't. So when she says the answer is always no unless you ask, believe her. She has the receipts. And when the MediChip goes into that first patient, I hope she lets herself feel all of it. The relief, the grief, and the quiet vindication of a daughter who turned the worst thing that ever happened to her into the reason anyone else might be spared it. If you want more from Outsider Inc., don't forget to subscribe to the platform at outsiderinc.substack.com. It's packed with highlights from today's episode and bonus insights you won't want to miss. You can follow Outsider Inc. on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn at Outsider Inc. Pod. You can also follow me on X at Ian Hathaway. Outsider Inc. is produced by Spellbinder Media. We'll be back soon with another fascinating outsider conversation. Until then, thank you so much for listening. And remember, great entrepreneurs can come from anywhere. See you next time.